Everyone seems to think that sewing is a skill when it's actually like 80 different skills plus an entirely new language. Ballpoint needles, betweens, bias neckline facing, bias ruffle, bias cut garment, blood. Removal of. I'm a little over into a year of sewing now, and I want to share a few lessons I've learned along the way, just the ones that have really stuck out to me. There's so much to know when it comes to sewing, and there are so many resources that I'm going to share with you, but I wanted to make a video about what has stood out to me most in terms of lessons learned and tips and tricks, and I want to share what I know with you while it's still fresh. Hello, I'm Christine. I am a card maker, I am a sewist, and I'm usually doing both. And today I'm doing sewing a year in review. Nearly a year ago today, I found a vintage 403B Singer sewing machine in the street with its manual that someone had printed out and left, and I really hope it was left for free because I definitely took it. Since then, I've been sewing up a storm, but I will tell you the beginning was not the easiest. The first thing I had to do that I didn't know I needed to do was get the machine serviced. And thank goodness I had a relative who sews because she was the one who shared that pearl of wisdom with me. I am now sharing it with you. If you get a used machine before you do anything, get it serviced if you can afford it. It's really worth it because if the machine has any ticks or sort of idiosyncrasies, you don't know that as a beginning sewist, and maybe your machine is not in perfect working order, and how would you know? And then it was time to thread the machine. I thought this would be so easy because I had hand sewn before. You put the thread through the needle and that's it, and you're done. You have a threaded needle. This is not so with a sewing machine, which has different sewing guides that you need to follow very precisely for the machine to work properly. Both the thread that comes down from the top of the machine and the thread from the bobbin join to make the stitch. And once you've got your machine threaded and your bobbin wound and it's going counterclockwise, when I pull on the string, the bobbin spins counterclockwise and it's caught properly in its casing. You need to get the bobbin and the thread to catch under the machine, and you still haven't even started sewing yet. So my second biggest tip, aside from getting your machine serviced if it's used, is to give yourself grace. This is a skill, it's a set of skills that takes a lot of time, a lot of patience, and you're gonna have to look things up. The internet is your friend. And because all machines are different, make friends with your machine's manual. Every machine has idiosyncrasies and does something a little different, and it's really helpful to know these going into it. Now, regardless of whether you read your entire manual beforehand or you don't, I did not read my whole manual, I would start with something just as simple as 2 pieces of fabric, not even a project in mind. What you want to do in the beginning is kind of get used to your machine and how it feels and the way the stitches are feeling under your hand. It's kind of like, I mean, I don't surf, but I imagine it's like surfing. First, you've got to learn to swim before you can get on the surfboard, I think. And that's the same with sewing. First, you just need to learn to sew a straight line before you can think about doing a project. Now, maybe not. Maybe you dive straight into the project. If you want to make that couture garment, dress, coat, jacket. If you want to make that couture jacket from the get-go, be my guest. Once you've gotten the feeling of the pedal and the feeling of the machine and you've sewn a few straight lines, then I'd say you're ready to dive into a project. I started with something very simple. In fact, I started with this pillowcase right here. And pillowcases are great because they're pretty much straight lines and they teach you a couple of new sewing techniques, but they don't overwhelm you. And once you've sewn something relatively small and easy, you've sewn a very quick win and you can feel proud and good. And if you're like me, you will use that pillowcase for the rest of your life, or at least for the next year. Now, once you've moved beyond your simple project, I say you're off to the races, make what you want to make. My aunt, who has sewn for a long time, recommended that I start with a gathered skirt. This is basically a large rectangle of fabric, and you learn a new skill beyond a straight line, which is gathering and a closure. I decided to take myself on a field trip to a local fabric store, even though I was super nervous because I felt like I did not know what I was doing. The people at the counter were super helpful. They recognized a new sewist when they saw her, and they ushered me over to the pattern section, and they helped me look through some different skirt options, helped me pick out a fabric, and I went home and I saw that the pattern had a sewing sew along on YouTube. This was a Megan Nielsen pattern, and it's a relatively newer pattern. There are many different types of patterns you can buy, but I would recommend starting with small indie companies because their patterns have instructions for sewists who are relatively new. A lot of older patterns assume that you already know how to sew, and they are not a great place to start for a beginning sewist because there's just a lot of assumed knowledge that you're not going to understand. This Megan Nielsen pattern was great, both because the instructions inside of the physical pattern were clear, and also because it had an online companion with even more details. And it had a sew along on YouTube, which was wonderful because I could see a human actually building the project from scratch. And this really saved me for my first project because it's just really hard for a pattern to communicate everything a beginning sewist could possibly need to know. But if there's a sew along and you're seeing the person go stitch by stitch, it's a lot easier to follow. Now for this first garment project that I did, I actually started with a practice garment, which I highly recommend you do if it's your first time sewing a jacket or a skirt or a pair of pants or whatever it is you're sewing. You want to start out with some fabric you don't necessarily care about. Bed sheets at Goodwill are a great purchase for this kind of thing. You can also buy old tablecloths. You can use something you already have that you're willing to cut up if the pattern pieces fit. And there's also a special cloth you can buy for this called Muslin, which has a little structure to it. And that's helpful for a lot of patterns too. Side note is that all of these options, bed sheets, tablecloths, muslin, work well for cotton projects. And I also really recommend you start with cotton, not with knits. That's like a whole new land. I'm just getting into that land and it's still ahead of me. So I recommend the cotton land, but up to you. And a practice project like this, which is actually called a muslin or a toile, is gonna help you get all of your mistakes out in advance. The last thing you wanna do is ruin a piece of fabric that you spent goodness knows how many dollars per yard on. Whoever told you sewing is cheap, I don't know. I've not found that to be true quite yet, but I've heard it gets cheaper as you go, so I'm waiting. Looking back, one of the things I think I did really right was to learn different seam finishes up front. Once you sew a seam down your fabric, you have to finish the seam because otherwise you have raw edges of fabric inside of your garment and those can fray and your garment will be ruined in the washing machine. So you need to finish your garment one way or another, but there are like many different kinds of seam finishes and they are all used for different purposes. But if you get going practicing those seam finishes from the get-go, it's just going to serve you down the line. Another thing I'd say I did well was to embrace the slowness of developing these skills. Sewing is not a single thing. It does take time and patience, and your brain is working overtime trying to learn all these things at once and incorporate them into a single project. So if you're trying to learn a quick skill, I don't know, maybe this is not it. And one of the things I really enjoy about the slow sewing is hand sewing. A lot of couture garments are actually almost made entirely by hand. I know we think sewing and we think sewing machine, but hand stitching is so valuable. You can get the most precise finishes with hand sewing, and you can kind of meditate while you're doing it. For my first Brumby skirt, I actually did a wide hem at the bottom, and a wide hem is tricky because it causes the fabric to pucker because there's some excess fabric when you fold it up into the skirt. And with hand stitching, you can use little strategic tucks to make sure that the hem is perfectly flat and totally invisible from the outside. Another tip I was really glad to get from the people who serviced my machine when I just hadn't even sewn anything was that when you're using a machine, you do need to backstitch all of your seams because otherwise the seam will come undone. If you go forward and you go straight onto your machine without kind of tacking it back in place, the threads will just come on out. The people at the sewing machine repair shop where I got it serviced recommended 3 stitches forward, 2 back, and then you sew your seam. And this was really helpful because a lot of patterns say backstitch at the beginning of your seam, but getting a few stitches onto your fabric is going to help the fabric from bunching up when you do the backstitch. Another good tip is to not invest any good money in a seam ripper. You are absolutely going to need a seam ripper. 100%, you're always going to need one, and a seam ripper undoes the work that you've done that you're not happy with, basically. It rips the seam open, also called an unpick. But these get really dull really fast, and one mistake I made was buying a really beautifully carved wooden seam ripper. I was trying to go for the vintage antique vibe, and then I found out it gets dull within like the first month of me using it. So buy the cheap seam rippers. You're gonna need many of them throughout the course of your sewing. Now I wanna leave you with some resources because sewing is not a solo activity. My first suggestion would be to see if you have a local fabric store or a local sewing school where you can meet some fellow humans who already know what they're doing. This is far and away the best way to learn sewing, and it is worth the money that you will spend on the classes. However, we may not all have a sewing school, or if you're like me and you're too afraid to start blind at a sewing school, there is the internet. And I'd highly recommend checking out Evelyn Wood's YouTube channel. I'll link her below. She gives the clearest instruction I have seen anywhere online, and she has so many different sewing videos and also a sewing school that you can pay to join, which I did, and I think it was totally worth it. Another favorite resource of mine is the Love to Sew podcast. This is just like sewing chit chat, motivation, also really inclusive patterning, and pattern companies are represented on that podcast. It's a very welcoming show. It's a very light, lovely Canadian vibe. And my final suggestion for a resource is to look up a local free gifting community. I found one on Facebook where you can type ISO, the letters ISO, which stands for in search of, notions, sewing fabric, stash. You know, people want to de-stash all the time. So before you invest a ton of money in all the tools that you can get with sewing, of which there are many, I would recommend going the free route first. And it's kind of nice to meet people who are de-stashing, and you can make connections like that too. Oh, and a bonus tip. Making cards is an excellent way to use up the little teeny leftover scraps that you really don't want to throw away. I hope this video has helped or given you some inspiration or motivation, and I'm thinking of doing a series of these. This was like my test run, and I feel like I have more to say. In my next video, I want to share with you the outfit I made to meet my celebrity crush, which I have not had the chance yet to meet him and wear the outfit, but it's ready. And I want to talk about making a project that's very special to you, because that's where it gets really juicy and exciting. All right, friends, thank you for joining. If you have a minute, please take the time to like this video, only of course if you like it. You can dislike it too. I guess the algorithm, it takes it all into account as good attention, but I'd rather you like it, and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more. Happy sewing!